Come on. There we go. Okay. All right. Sorry about that delay. And okay. So welcome to the first Wednesday in November. And I thought because healthcare is universal healthcare is a subject for debate among the Democratic candidates, I thought it would be interesting to look at it from a Jewish perspective and see if there's anything new or unusual that Judaism has to say about the concept of healthcare or universal healthcare. So, in doing research for this class, I came across two sources that I would highly recommend. One is this book called The Observant Life. It is a guide that is published by the Rabbinical Assembly on matter. It's called The Wisdom of Conservative Judaism for Contemporary Jews. So there was a book that came out 50 years ago, 40 years ago by Rabbi Isaac Klein called A Guide to Jewish Religious Practice. And that essentially was an English translation of what is known as the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, the abridged Shulchan Aruch, which was a basic one-volume guide for a quick reference of what does Judaism tell me I have to do now. So the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch would tell you, quickly how to do Sukkot, how to do Shabbat, things like that. And Isaac Klein's Guide to Jewish Religious, Guide to Jewish Religious Practice, had that in English, and it was not really accessible for the average Jew. You really had to know something in order to find your way through it, because there are a lot of abbreviations, a lot of references to Jewish sources that if you're not an educated Jew, you would be lost in it, and you would need a guide for the guide. So, but it's a book that is on most rabbis' shelves. And then a few years ago, the Rabbinical Assembly decided that, and this was published 7 years ago already, to update Isaac Klein's book, make it accessible for all, and create this one volume, it's a pretty thick volume, guide for the observant life. So that the topics, how it's divided is prayer, then it's synagogue life, then it's Torah study, Shabbat, the holidays, Jewish life cycle, the dietary laws, Israel, personal integrity, public appearance and behavior, charitable giving, repentance. Then it's also, so all of that is the essential Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. Really, that's basically everything you need to know. But then there are other elements that are added here, like citizenship, meaning the pursuit of a just society, separation of church and state. There's civic morality, there's the secular justice system, there's crime and punishment, military service, commerce between employers and employees, among co-workers, contracts, taxation, loans and lending, intellectual property, gossip, slander, tale-bearing, bequests, and inheritance. Then there's another section called Deeds of Loving Kindness, which deals with marriage, sex, same-sex relationships, parent-child, siblings, grandparents, neighbors, interfaith relations, medical ethics. Aha! So that got me. And in there is the communal obligation of healthcare. Okay, so this section is written by Rabbi Avram Reisner, and he is an expert on biomedical ethics and has written a lot within the conservative movement, a number of teshuvot, official halachic papers about a whole variety of biomedical ethical issues. In fact, there is a healthcare proxy. I mean, we know about healthcare proxies and do not resuscitate orders. And there is, if you went on the Rabbinical Assembly, if you Googled Rabbinical Assembly healthcare proxy, you would come up with a Jewish version of that, which, of course, because it's the conservative movement, gives you options in there, like feeding tube, no feeding tube. Is it okay to withdraw a feeding tube once it's in or not? So there are different opinions, and Avram Reisner has one of those opinions, usually a more conservative with a small c approach. There's also caring for the needy, individuals with disabilities, animals, and the environment. So all of this, 900 some odd pages, it's a good reference guide for a quick reference about a particular topic. And then, like tonight's topic, that section, the communal obligation of healthcare, gives references for further research. But it's written in a very easy way that you don't need to be, you don't need to have a background in Jewish law in order to understand it. The 3-page section that's in here about universal healthcare refers to a chapter in this book written by Rabbi Elliot Dorff, who is another expert in Jewish law for the conservative movement. He's the current chair of the law committee of the conservative movement, and has been a professor of philosophy and Jewish thought at what used to be called the University of Judaism, and now it's the American Jewish University out in Los Angeles, which has a rabbinical school, which is the equivalent of the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. So Elliot Dorff has done a lot of writing about a variety of issues related to Jewish law, and he's an ethicist. And this book came out in the early 90s, and on the sleeve, it says, Dr. Elliot Dorff, a conservative rabbi, served as a member of Hillary Rodham Clinton's 1993 task force on healthcare. He has written numerous articles on Jewish thought and is the co-author of Contemporary Jewish Ethics and Morality and A Living Tree, The Roots and Growth of Jewish Law. But since then, he has written many more books, and he has a series of 3 or 4 about different elements of social justice issues, and this is one of them, called Matters of Life and Death, A Jewish Approach to Modern Medical Ethics. Towards the end of the book, he has a whole chapter related about non-medical aspects of medical care, in which he discusses in great length the idea of the Jewish perspective on healthcare. So all of that is one part of this background, and another part of this background is, and just Googling universal healthcare, or actually I Googled healthcare for all. There happens to be a website, and I didn't have a chance to check the authenticity of this website, but it seems like it's a pretty good website. It's called procon.org. So I don't know if anybody has ever heard of that. It's pros and cons of current issues, reliable, nonpartisan, and empowering. So I think, especially in this day and age of civil discourse, which is which is the opposite of this website, I think that this website is good. So there is a whole section there of the right to health care. And it lists pros and cons, but it gives this background. So it says 28.5 million people in the United States, which is 8.8% of the US population, so almost 10%, do not have health insurance. Among people who do have health insurance, 2/3 have private insurance, while 1/3 have government provided coverage through programs such as Medicaid or Medicare. Okay, so of the 90% of people in the United States that have health care, 2/3 of them have private health insurance. 1/3 of the 90% of Americans who have health insurance have government provided coverage, Medicare and Medicaid. Employer-based health insurance is the most common type of coverage, applying to 56% of the US population. The United States is the only nation among the 36 OECD nations, which is Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, that does not have universal health care either in practice or by constitutional right. Okay, so that's interesting, that of the 36, I would then guess that these are the most economically advanced nations in the world. The United States is the only one that does not have universal health care either in practice or by constitutional right. Proponents of the right to health care say that no one in one of the richest nations on earth should go without health care. They argue that a right to health care would stop medical bankruptcies, improve public health, reduce overall health care spending, help small businesses, right? Because small businesses find it hard to provide health insurance for its employees. And it might be hard for them, that's listed further down in this on this website, might be hard for them to invest in healthcare for all its employees. If everybody gets healthcare, then big business, small business, it doesn't matter. The government's paying for the healthcare, not businesses, right? So that's why it would help small businesses, and that healthcare should be an essential government service. Opponents argue that a right to healthcare amounts to socialism, and that it should be an individual's responsibility, not the government's role, to secure healthcare. They say that government provision of healthcare would decrease the quality and availability of healthcare and would lead to larger government debts and deficits. So the website goes on to list more than 10 pros and cons. It then goes on to a history. Do you know that President Nixon advocated universal health care? He's a Republican, right? And he advocated for universal health care. In 1971, President Richard Nixon laid out a national health strategy to reform the health insurance system and move towards universal health care. 1972 message to Congress, President Nixon continued to advocate for universal health care, arguing that, quote, reform of our healthcare system so that every citizen will be able to get quality health care at reasonable cost, regardless of income and regardless of area of residence, remains an item of highest priority on my unfinished agenda for America in the 1970s, end quote. Okay, who would have thought that a Republican, he had no care for domestic policies. Okay, well, but so David is suggesting he had only interest in foreign policy, and we remember him going to China. But okay, but the point is, President Nixon advocated for universal health care, and there was a competing plan by Senator Ted Kennedy called the Health Security Act. And despite their efforts, by the end of the Nixon presidency, no health care legislation had reached the president's desk. Okay, so I just found that fascinating, that here the Republicans are anti-universal health care, but President Nixon, who was pretty conservative Republican was advocating for it. So, Jewishly, about matters of healthcare, the sources about healthcare are pretty scarce, and that's because, and Elliot Dorff makes this fascinating point, that before 1938, with the discovery of penicillin, doctors essentially provided palliative care, right? You either, if you were sick before 1938 with an infection, it was 50-50 whether you would survive, right? Without penicillin, 50-50 whether you would survive. And a doctor wouldn't be able to help you because the doctor didn't have a cure. A doctor would be trained in doing surgery, so you could amputate your leg and do other kinds of surgeries, but the result of the surgery could just as much kill you as the surgery itself because there's no penicillin. So there was, during the Civil War, there was ether so that you would be able to be put to sleep while you're having surgery, but still, what were doctors doing? So just a fascinating point that before penicillin, before actually people got better through medicine, it was a toss-up. People were dying left and right, and mortality rate, I mean, the average life expectancy is pretty low, right? So it's only since 1938 that healthcare has really changed to the point that it is now, with the discovery of further medicines and cures, etc., where now the medical profession is really quite the science. Before that, it was a matter of being trained on how to be a surgeon. Okay, so now, therefore, Jewish sources on healthcare are not what we would expect, and we would have to look at different kinds of sources that would apply to the issues relating to healthcare. Okay, so in other words, let's compare this. Jewish sources know nothing about automobiles, right? But it does know about lighting a fire, and it does know about travel, and it does know about work. So you apply work, fire, travel to something new that the source doesn't know about, and apply those issues that the sources do know about to the new invention, because that's what you have to do to understand this new invention in light of previous sources. You get what I'm saying then? Okay. So the same is true for healthcare. Now, there is a classic source that both Reisner and Dorff refer to, and that is that, let's see this. Yes. There's a classic source that says where we should live and what kind of town we should live in terms of the services provided in that town. And if these 10 things aren't there, we shouldn't live in that town. Okay? So it says, this is in the tractate Sanhedrin, which mainly deals with law courts and the kinds of cases that go to kinds of courts, and also deals with capital punishment. But so in the tractate Sanhedrin on page 17b, it says a scholar, and by extension you could say anybody, but a scholar may not reside in a city that does not have the following 10 things: a court of justice, a charitable fund, a synagogue, a bathhouse. Remember, this is written in the time of the Talmud, so we're talking at least 1,500 years ago. So a bathhouse, a public privy, a physician. So that's number 6 on the list, a physician, and it's Unclear exactly what that physician was. Usually a physician in the Talmud was a bloodletter. Okay, so either you just stick a pin or a knife in somebody and a certain part of the body, depending on what was wrong with the person, and let blood flow that way, or you apply leeches also to depending on which part of the body is affected, and hope that through your training as a physician, you know where to draw the blood or apply the leech or leeches. Okay, so you need so the sixth thing on the list is a physician, a trained surgeon, a scribe, a butcher, and a school teacher. So these are 10 things that a town needs to have for a scholar to live in. Uh, uh, so I was just distracted by somebody who had written a note. So that's one element of this. So you need to live in a town that has a physician and a surgeon. Also, then, there are two other sources by which Dorff focuses on in his chapter to learn, to teach us about um, uh, the responsibility of the community for other members of the community, right? So one of the things on this list was a charitable fund. So it's quite clear in the Mishnah and in the Talmud that when a town, when Jews move to an area and establish a town, one of the first things they do, besides buying land for a cemetery, is to establish a charitable fund so that the poor of the town are taken care of. And there's extensive literature uh, about this. So, for example, we have in rabbinic literature this paragraph: the soup kitchen should provide enough food. The soup kitchen of the town should provide enough food for a full day, but the communal fund, which is a financial, like the bank of the town, gives sufficient food to last from 1 week to the next. So the soup kitchen has to provide enough food for the poor people of the town for 1 day. The communal fund has to provide enough money for poor people to buy food to last them for a week. Okay? The soup kitchen provides for anybody, but the communal fund gives support only to the poor of that town. So, in other words, if you come to town that day and you're poor, you can know that you can go to the soup kitchen and get a meal, and no questions are going to be asked of you. But if you're going to get money from the communal fund, you're going to need to show proof of residence. Okay. A poor person living in the town for 30 days attains the status of being a resident of the locale for purposes of receiving assistance from the communal fund. But to receive shelter, he must have lived there for 6 months. And to be liable to the town tax, he must have been a resident for 12 months. So this is the idea behind this is that Jewish towns, or towns that have large Jewish populations, would be responsible for their own people, right? And throughout most of Jewish history in Europe, that was the case. That Jews were told to take care of your own, and the Christian, and it was the same for Muslims and all other groups of people. Well, maybe I'm overstepping that. I know for sure that that was the case for Jews. Jews throughout Christian Europe were told to take care of their own. They had a tax that they had to pay to the to the government or to the church for protection. And then the Jewish community taxed its own people in order to take care of its own. So that would mean to provide for a rabbi for the community, to provide for a shochet, the ritual slaughterer for the community, a mohel, and all these other, the communal fund, etc. They would tax their own. And the sources also said that the authorities, the Jewish authorities for the town, had the right to get the money from the people who weren't paying the money. So they absolutely had the right to impose this tax and to have the authority to go get it. Okay, so it's not like Jewish life in America today, which is all voluntary. Jewish life in Europe, especially in the ghetto, was obligatory. Like if you're a Jew in that town, you were expected either, if you were poor, you were going to be taken care of by the community, and if you were not poor, you were going to give your fair share, your tax, to the community. That tax would be up to 20% of your property. You should expect to give to charity. Okay, and that the communal fund authority had the right to extract that money from all the residents. Okay, so there's that element of communal funds. That in other words, that part of being Jewish, and the sources make clear, is to support other Jewish people. Now, there happens to be a hierarchy of how to do that. So a lot of sources point out that you have to take care of your own first, and there are concentric circles. You take care of yourself, you take care of your family, you take care of your parents, you take care of your siblings, you take care of your cousins, then you take care of other people in the town, and then you take care of people in other towns. So through these concentric circles, that's the hierarchy of who we're supposed to take care of. Okay, so communal fund, there's a long Jewish history of communal funds, of taking care of each other, and there is a hierarchy of how we are supposed to take care of one another. One essential element that is common to all Jewish communities throughout Jewish history is the idea that Jews are taken captive, and that a key element of a budget of these communal funds is setting aside money to redeem captives. Jews were taken captive all the time, all kinds of Jews. So whether you're traveling, travel was a very dangerous business to people weren't traveling for leisure. They were traveling for business. You really needed to have protection, bodyguards, because there were robbers along the way. And so once you left the city that you're in and left the wall, then it's a free-for-all until you get to the next city and you get into the protection of the wall of that city. So between cities is a very dangerous place, and people could have been taken captive. Within the city itself, Jews could have been taken captive as well. There are many sources throughout Jewish literature about rabbis being taken captive. And one famous rabbi, Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, who was taken captive and told his town, do not spend the money to redeem me, because he didn't want his town to waste the money on him. And even though he went against Jewish law, because you're supposed to redeem a scholar first and foremost over anybody else, and he refused his town to pay the ransom for him, and he stayed in jail for a number of years until he was in prison. He was imprisoned by the authorities because the authorities wanted more money. So sometimes they would take Jews captive, or the leader of the Jewish community captive, in order to blackmail the town, or to get more money out of the town for whatever.
These aren't criminals.
No, they're not. No. Oh, well, the people taking the Jews captive are criminals. They don't have. There's no good reason to do that. But the person taken captive, literally. So in other words, Julian, let's say you were the leader of the community, and this was in Christian Europe. The priest of the town or the bishop of the town would say, you know what? We need some money to pay for this new thing in the church, or we need more money for a conference that we're going to. Oh, I have an idea. Let's take Julian captive and charge ransom to the Jewish community in order to pay for this thing. That's what would happen throughout Christian Europe. Okay? Yes. And so we're told throughout in the sources that we are supposed to redeem you. Okay, so it doesn't happen today, right? This concept is an unusual concept for us because, I mean, there are criminals who kidnap people, right? Okay, this is not like that. This is because criminals are kidnapping rich people, right? And then asking for a ransom for the rich people, right? So they're demanding, and so it's more of a private thing, knowing that you can take a chance in getting money from somebody wealthy. This is purely anti-Semitic and purely part and parcel of being part of the Jewish community 1,000 years ago, even 500 years ago, even sooner than 500 years ago. It was so not in modern times, but this would happen all the time, mainly in Christian Europe, right? So for a scenario that I just laid out. And so then it would be up to the Jewish town council to convene. Okay, we got this message from the bishop. Julian has been taken captive. We need to pay this off. We have no choice, right? So in other words, somebody couldn't say, well, I hate Julian, or Julian owes us money. So, what they could do, let's say you didn't pay your tax to the Jewish communal fund that year, they would pay the ransom, but then charge you to pay back to the town council your share of that to pay off your tax for the communal fund that year. That the Jewish Community Fund could do, but all things being equal, they couldn't say, well, Julian, well, he's 119 years old. And so is it really worth it to pay? Because, we only live to 120. So why bother? No, there wasn't any hierarchy like that. Okay. So any Jew who's taken captive, you gotta take them, you gotta pay the ransom and get them back. Okay. So that's another element that is related to this topic of universal health care, taking care of all people in the community who are at risk. When you're taken captive, you are at risk. The hierarchy in terms of, let's say there are more than one Jew taken captive at a time, who do you redeem first? You always redeem a woman first. Because not just is there a danger to one's life in captivity in general, because you don't know what the conditions of captivity are, you do have the danger of rape. And so that's the extra danger that a woman is confronted with if she's taken captive over a man. So you always redeem a woman first, then you would redeem a man. But then if you also have a choice, the rabbis did have a hierarchy of scholar, Kohen Gadol, a Levi, that kind of thing. So there were times where there would be several Jews taken captive at once, and they'd have to make a choice as to who they're going to redeem first. But there is, so again, what we have, the sources that we can use for the conversation about universal health care, because there are no sources on universal health care, are the communal fund, that, in other words, we are all responsible for taking care of one another, and the idea of keeping people safe. If people are taken captive, then they are in danger, and we have the responsibility to save them from danger. So healthcare, providing for healthcare, is providing for the well-being of the community. So see, this is how Jewish legal scholars work today. If you're dealing with a topic that hasn't been really dealt with as such in the sources 500,000 years ago, then you have to get down to the basic principles that are at play in the topic and look for those principles as they have been discussed previously in the sources. So in other words, so for universal healthcare, the idea is communal fund and also redeeming the captive. Those are the basic elements. And essentially, because this is no great chiddush here, there's no great innovation or teaching here, it seems pretty clear that we have the responsibility to take care of, health-wise, everybody in the community. The only discussion is to what extent. Okay, so in other words, is it Jewish? No, let's say it this way. There's no way that anybody can say, or any rabbi or any legal scholar can say, that we must vote for Elizabeth Warren because her universal health plan is the Jewish health plan that we need to enforce in America. Nobody can say that. So in other words, as long as 100% of the population is covered by health care, then that is a Jewish approach to health care. How we get there is a matter of politics and policy. Judaism teaches that all should receive and have the right to receive health care. Okay? How we do it, how much of an extent of healthcare. So the rest of Elliot Dorff's chapter talks about the amount of money that you want to invest in healthcare treatment plans, in special equipment, transplant surgery, or other very expensive treatment plans. All of this can be a matter of debate as to what the community is going to pay for and how they're going to decide who receives it and who doesn't receive it. So in other words, so in the universal healthcare debate, the question is, how, if you're going to have single pay and they go to one place to get your health care, well, then you might have to wait a while, like as it is in Canada, for example. You can't just go to the doctor one day and get your CAT scan the next day. I believe you have to wait in line, and it might be several weeks until you get a CAT scan. I don't know how cancer treatment is done or anything like that, but that's a risk that opponents of universal health care will bring up, that we're going to have to wait in line, doctors aren't going to be paid as much, and there could be abuses within the system. So, and there was something in that article as well, that breast cancer survival rate are the highest in America and Sweden. And then other countries that have universal health care, the survival rate is lower. So the questions are, does it have something to do with how long you're waiting for the treatment, where you can go to get the treatment, et cetera, et cetera. So these are other questions. Jewishly, the issue is that we agree Jewishly that everybody needs to have equal access to healthcare. So, with all those points that I brought up, are there any questions or comments? So, yes. So, okay. So first, the two things. Saul says all these rules in the books are derived from the Torah. So, all I presented tonight are not necessarily rules; they are guidelines that the rabbis derive from the Torah. So there's nothing in the Torah about a doctor. The doctor doesn't appear in the Torah at all, but the idea that so one foundational element here is, do we have the right to be a doctor? Because if theologically you can argue that God is going to heal us, so in other words, if we're sick, it's because God wants us to be sick, and all we have to do is pray and be a better person, and then we get better. So theologically, you can make that argument, and therefore, if we train to be a doctor, we are going against God's plan, and who are we as human beings to go against God's plan? So it's clear from the sources, and we won't go into it now, but it's clear from the sources that we have the right to be a doctor, that we are God's instrument on earth to help people get better. Okay, so that's how the rabbis understand it. So that the whole idea of medicine and doctors are all part of helping God repair the world and make the world a better place. So it's like the argument about the floodwaters rising and the guy in the house saying he's going to wait for God to help. So the rowboat comes. No, I'm waiting. He goes to the roof. The helicopter comes. No, I'm waiting. He finally dies in the floodwaters. And God said, I sent the rowboat and I sent the helicopter. Why didn't you get in? So in other words, in the same vein, doctors, nurses, all these people who help make people better and make society better are God's instruments on earth. So that's the basis for healthcare and medicine and doctors. And that's how it's derived from the Torah. Secondly, about them being rules. So there are these, again, these guidelines that, because the Torah does talk about how we are responsible for the poor and disadvantaged in the community. Just look throughout the book of Deuteronomy for the 7-year agricultural cycle. Each year that agricultural cycle, a tithe or 2 tithes are given to support the Levites or the poor and the widow and the orphan in the community. We're supposed to leave a corner of the field for the poor. Doesn't say how big the corner should be. And when we are in the process of harvesting, if we forget something, we can't go back and get it. If something falls out of our hands while we are harvesting, we can't bend down and pick it up. And because we're supposed to leave those things for the poor. So it's quite clear in the Torah that taking care of the poor and the disadvantaged is something that is a basic element of Judaism that goes back 3,000 years. It's the rabbis who extend that and make it practical. Okay, so when people are living in cities and they're not farming, okay, how are we taking care of the poor if we don't have fields? Okay, so then the communal fund is the same thing as leaving the gleanings for the poor. This is the way that we are providing that. So it's not that it's a rule, it's now applying these principles So I'd rather call them principles rather than rules for understanding this. So it's in understanding the communal fund and understanding how the community took care of people in danger before. That's how we understand the issue of healthcare today. Any other? Yes, Bess.
Talk about organ donation.
Yes. A mitzvah. Are we obliged to? Right. So it's So Bess is bringing up the question of organ donation, whether we're obliged to do that. You can't force anyone to do that. Okay. So I would say that it would be nice to do that. It would be recommended to list yourself on the Maryland driver's license as an organ donor, because that would be all things being equal and understanding organ donation today, and that it is, as opposed to 50 years ago when it wasn't so sure that donating an organ would actually save a life because of all other complications that would go with it. Today, it's pretty sure that if an organ is donated, that person's going to live a quality life. And so therefore, it's okay to desecrate the body of the nearly dying person or the life support person in order to save somebody else's life or several other people's lives. And that is something, but you can't force somebody to do that, but it is recommended to do that. Yes. What do you mean? Oh, no, what? Well, so Bess is saying it sounds like ethical culture as opposed to religious dictate. So my approach to Judaism in general and how I teach it is not about you must do this, you must not do that. That's just not how I approach things. I personally understand these as Jewish moral and ethical guidelines, not just civic moral and ethical guidelines. And so, other religions have other things to say, different things to say about organ donation, about healthcare, about all of this stuff. And it's just not to say that they're wrong and we're right, just saying that Judaism has these particular principles that underlie how we act as a person. And it just how we act as a person then helps define what it means to be Jewish. And it's all based on ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your neighbor as you'd want to be loved. So since we personally want to stay alive, you can use the beginning of the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Yes, since we all want that, then that's what we need to provide for other people too. And that by living a Jewish lifestyle, then we are pursuing a lifestyle of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We'll be happy if we believe in God and we follow these ethical, moral, and ritual precepts. So, but some things are just not, I could say that we must keep kosher, but I wouldn't tell somebody who doesn't keep kosher that they can't come into the synagogue. There are certain synagogues that would do that, but I just wouldn't do that. So I can't tell somebody you must be an organ donor. So personally, you might just not want to do that. You don't want to think about it now. You want to wait for some other time, or who knows what the issues are with organ donation. You just don't want to do it. So you can't say that that you're wrong in not doing it. But you can say that would be a good thing to do it. So certain things are kind of sound this way, as opposed to you must light the Shabbos candles at candle lighting time. That's not like there's no wishy-washy way. Well, you could do it an hour before, you could do it an hour. You can't. You really are supposed to do it at candle lighting time, as opposed to how much money are you going to give to the communal fund this year? Well, you got a guideline up to 20%. So is 1% okay? Well, not really, but you've given something, so that's good. So you see what I'm saying? So, so some of these things, they're a huge gray area that you can't really legislate. And especially in a voluntary Jewish society as we have today, it's all up to individual Jews what to do. In other words, our synagogue has the policy of membership, right? But are we going to turn people away if they're not going to pay the dues, the right amount? I mean, are we in a position to turn people away to say that? I mean, there are some large synagogues who will maintain a waiting list and ask for tax returns to determine exactly how much you need to pay in order to be a member. And if you don't pay that, you're not a member of the synagogue. But we're not in the position to do that, nor would we necessarily want to do that, right? So it's all voluntary today about how to affiliate with the Jewish community, how to contribute to the Jewish community, and maintain the Jewish principles that have been there since the Mishnah and the Talmud, that the Jewish communal fund is an essential element of maintaining unity within the Jewish community. Adriana. So Adriana is asking, should we vote for a candidate, or should we not vote for a candidate who doesn't promote universal health care of some kind? So I'd say that there are a lot of factors involved in voting for a candidate. But all things being equal, I would say that social justice issues with universal health care just being one of many social justice issues too that Judaism would care about. I would say, from my understanding of the sources and what Rabbi Elliot Dorff is teaching, is that yes, American Jews should vote for candidates who represent I wouldn't say liberal necessarily, but I would say at least a centrist social justice agenda. So that would, in other words, promote caring for the environment, caring for the poor, caring for the disadvantaged in the community. It's some kind of a policy that would take care of people in society who can't take care of people themselves, promote education, gun control. Issues like this, I think, are Jewish issues and should be, and we as American Jews should vote for candidates who espouse these positions. Yes, so therefore I'm becoming political now, and you would then surmise from what I'm saying that Jews need to vote Democrat. So essentially, yes, historically, Jews have voted for the Democratic Party and Democratic candidates because the Democratic Party historically has promoted a social justice agenda. And the Republican Party has not, except for what I read at the beginning, that President Nixon wanted a universal health care, which is and he founded the EPA. So there you go. So anyway, so then what should we have voted for? So I'm not going there. So I'm just saying, you need to vote for candidates. And depending on where you live, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party candidates might be only very, very slightly different because of the makeup of the constituency of that particular district, right? So in other words, Connie Morella, who was a Republican congressman from Montgomery County, succeeded because she espoused a moderate centrist Republican position on a variety of issues that enabled, and then she was popular and enabled Democrats to feel okay about voting for her. until the district was gerrymandered so that only a Democrat would win that, and Chris Van Hollen won the district. No?
Already, yes. And,
It's okay, so that could be one, but anyway, the district was gerrymandered. It was. Just take a look at District 3. John Sarbanes is the congressman. I know districts keep on getting gerrymandered. That's all I'm saying. But the idea is that Connie Morella succeeded in Montgomery County because she knew her constituency, and she made, like some of the Democratic candidates now are changing their positions a little bit. I mean, I didn't read the article, but Pete Buttigieg, for example, is becoming a little bit more moderate or centrist, knowing that, oh, he's gotten some traction now. And if he wants to really succeed, he has to understand that he needs to be more moderate than liberal. I'm not promoting Pete Buttigieg. I'm only giving this as an example that Republican or Democrat, we as Jews should vote for candidates who espouse a social justice agenda. That's what I would say is a Jewish perspective on this. Jack, you had your hand up before.
You mentioned that when Jews were kidnapped and held for ransom,
Yeah.
there was
A hierarchy of how to redeem them if there happen to be more than one at the same time.
Thinking about our topic of providing medical help.
Yes.
And the concept of triage.
Yes.
When there is not enough medical
Right.
help to go around.
Yes.
How does
So that's a whole different chapter in this book in terms of how doctors should treat patients, and how, and if you're out in a war and you have the MASH unit, how to triage patients. So yes, it's very, very difficult. Medical ethics at the time. So, right, there are a number of factors that a doctor and a hospital would have to weigh in terms of treating a patient. Whether a patient can afford the care is way down on the list. It's more about whether the patient is healthy enough to undergo that particular treatment. That's the number one issue. Okay,
so really it's a question of what is the likelihood of survival?
Exactly, the likelihood of survival of this patient versus that patient, and who can wait longer. Right? So who is the most at risk that needs to be handled now? It's not about whether that person can afford it. So a doctor has to be colorblind and finance blind. That's ideally, right? So in other words, so I don't know. There are certain hospitals around that, treat homeless people or anybody else that doesn't have health insurance. Okay, right. Emergency rooms do that. Okay, so then hospitals have to budget for that, right? For the amount of people who don't have health insurance that they're going to treat. They do, but they treat the people. Who come in. Okay, so then you hope that's why hospitals have fundraisers in order to, right? So, and it depends on what economic area a hospital is in, right? So a hospital that's in a very urban, low-income area is going to see more non-insurance patients, most likely, than a hospital in a very affluent suburb where you would think most people have health insurance, right? So those hospitals will survive better financially than hospitals in the highly urban, low-income area. They would need extra support from outside income in order to pay for these non-insurance people who are coming into the emergency room. So that's a whole bigger crisis that we're not handling here. All I'm saying, Jack, in answer to you, is that as you triage a patient Jewishly, a doctor is not supposed to look at the wallet to determine whether the doctor is going to treat that patient or not. That's not the issue. An acceptable triage is this person healthy enough to survive whatever treatment they need right now? That's the way to approach it. Okay, so thank you very much and have a good night. Thanks.